Maha's hands rattled as she shook a cigarette out of the packet, then snapped the lighter half a dozen times before a flame finally held. She held it up and began to puff, then put the lighter back on the little metal table and attempted to make herself comfortable. The straw from her little wicker chair poked into her right leg, so she crossed it over the left, leaned back, and finally inhaled deeply. Staring blankly at the birdcage hanging in the space between herself and the building behind her, Maha refused to think, simply breathing in of the warmth filling her lungs. After a few deep breaths, her hand dropped to her side. She continued to stare at the canary in the cage, endowed with the most impersonal name possible, Bird, for several long moments, ignoring the embers beginning to crumble to the ground. Bird stared back at her for a moment, then began to sing, jovially hopping back and forth on his little wooden log of a seat, alternately facing Maha and the neighbor's back window, which was mere inches from the cage. Maha's eyes were drawn to a flicker of light in the neighbor's window, and she muttered a curse under her breath. Houses in Beirut were built way too close together, and she hated the persistent lack of privacy. She had no idea who lived in the flat behind her, and yet there was no way of escaping their blunt participation in her world. Her mind easily began to list other things she hated about Beirut. The pollution and smog, the disgusting tap water which created a greasy film on her sink every day, the frequent power cuts which seemed to remind the populace that the Lebanese war had never officially ended because no country in its right mind chose not to prioritize establishing a dependable electric grid as a symbol of its newfound stability, the aloof cockiness of the Lebanese, the constant fear of being exploited by a taxi driver, even the humble Syrian, Palestinian, and Sri Lankan men who cleaned her street in their pristine Suclean uniforms, epitomizing the hegemony of big business across this tiny country. She missed Syria so very much. Not the Syria of today. Today, she was glad that there were 2 mountain ranges between herself and the horrors causing her beloved land to disintegrate into a pile of rubble. She was not glad that there were 2 mountain ranges between herself and her mother, and she was not yet entirely able to fathom the 2 mountain ranges between herself and the funeral for her father and her youngest brother happening this very afternoon. But the Syria that she'd grown up in, studied in, the Syria where she'd met her husband and grown into womanhood, the Syria that she'd left a few years ago, thinking she was accompanying her husband for a 2-year training course and entirely unaware that she would never live in the real Syria, her Syria again. Her thoughts turned to the broad verandas on the mountain overlooking the desert in her native town of Sidnaya, and to the bright red Moro oranges that grew in the mosaic tiled courtyard of her aunt's ancient Damascus home. She thought of the flowers that bloomed through much of spring and summer, the scent of jasmine, and the purple and crimson blossoms on the bushes in front of most every home, which stood in direct contrast with the crowded, filthy concrete streets of Beirut. She thought of how she could drive from one end of Damascus to the other in just over 10 minutes, even at the worst moment of rush hour. An hour before the fast was to be broken during Ramadan, Damascus traffic flowed better than Beirut traffic at any time of day. She thought of the food her mother cooked and the sandwiches she sometimes bought on the street while out running errands. Every bite of food in Syria vibrated with a rich flavor which made any Lebanese meal feel as bland as the bread with which it was served. As she neared the end of her now familiar mental recitation of things she missed about Syria, she remembered the cigarette in her hand and put it up to her mouth. Her mind began to drift to her father and 13-year-old brother Hani. Neither of them had ever held a gun, she was sure of it. Her father had no brothers, and so he had been exempt from military service, and like most other Christians from her town, her family was determined to stay out of the conflict, keep their heads down, and stay alive. But vengeance fell on them, just as if they'd been leaders of a militia. Every fighter in Syria had innocent blood on his hands now, and that blood now included blood from Maha's family, her own blood. As she sucked the last of the nicotine out of the tiny cigarette butt, she once again resolved to deaden her heart. With her husband Samir, Maha still traveled regularly back to Syria to help. They would take food, clothes, bedding, anything they could rummage up to pass on to families fleeing the Damascus suburbs where the bombing was the worst. On these trips, Maha often sat with women who had lost everything, their children, their husbands, their homes. She listened to them, cried with them, and prayed with them. But now, alone in Beirut, a world away from her own mother who had just become a widow, she felt no sympathy, no compassion for those widows in the shelters in Damascus. For months now, she had just been going through the motions, aware that if she allowed herself to engage emotionally in what she was witnessing on her trips home, her heart would take a strong whack with each sob story she heard, and it would not withstand the beating. Instead, she was resolved to keep her heart out of it. And that was before the senseless destruction literally landed on her own doorstep. Now no doorstep remained, though apparently the television had been left intact, with a little doily on top. She shed no tears. Instead, she smoked. Just as she was stamping out the cigarette, her phone, which lay beside the ashtray, began to vibrate. Leila tapped her fingernails on the dark gray granite surface of the kitchen island as she held the phone to her ear and waited for her friend to pick up. After 4 rings, Maha answered. "Darling Leila, how are you? I've missed you." "Oh, I've missed you too. What's new with you?" But rather than wait for an answer, Leila said what she had called to say. "I saw your Facebook post. May God have mercy on their souls." Maha chuckled. "Do you know what they found in the rubble? The entire house destroyed, but the television still upright with that little doily crocheted by my grandma on top. My mom always wanted to throw that doily out because it was so old, and it's the only stupid thing that survived. That and a TV of all things." Leila joined Maha in a few moments of hearty laughter, much more cheery than such a story should warrant. Once the chuckles had faded, Leila asked Maha the practical questions. "What will your mother do? Will you go back to Syria for the funeral?" "I've been trying to convince my parents to come to Lebanon for ages, since the beginning really, but Mama doesn't want to leave. She says it is her home, and if the Christians all flee Syria, then we are just offering it to the Islamists. She will go to Damascus to stay with Auntie. Praise God, so far, the Bab Tuma neighborhood is still safe." "And you?" reminded Leila. "Maha told me not to come, that it's too dangerous. It's silly because I go to Sham all the time with Samir, but Sidnaya is now completely blocked off, so I couldn't get back home anyway." "Can you imagine? I'll never say goodbye to Baba, nor to my baby brother. He was about to start secondary school already, you know?" Those last words came out in gulps, as if Maha was forcing the tears back. Masha'Allah, God creates and man takes away. Leila herself had not escaped loss. Praise God, her immediate family was safe, living in a camp in the Jordanian desert, in a couple of shelters that looked like shipping containers donated by rich Arabian businessmen. As far as any of them knew, their village no longer existed, though no one had been able to cross the various front lines to check for many months now. 2 of her uncles and some of her cousins had joined the Free Syrian Army early on, and most of them had been killed in the fighting. One of her cousins, though, had proved himself to be a natural at war and had been promoted to officer in the FSA. Leila made it a point to not talk to him, ever. Sensing there was little more to say on the subject, Leila asked, "How's Samir?" On the phone line, Leila was convinced she felt Maha relaxing with the change of subject. "My husband is amazing. He's my hero. Everyone worries about me when I travel, and I worry too. But Samir, he's been detained a few times already. It doesn't stop him, though. He keeps traveling back and forth between Damascus and Beirut. He says he can't stop as long as there are people who don't have food to eat. He's here in Beirut right now, thank God. I'm going to keep traveling with him because there are so many women in Damascus who need someone to listen and just spend time with them. And plus, it's less scary to travel with your husband than it is to send him into harm's way. There's no way we could stop. Not as long as there's need." "So you're saying you've joined forces with a crazy man?" I'm saying he's a man of God. Leila nodded and smiled, then remembered Maha couldn't see her smiles over the phone. She didn't want her friend to get the wrong idea, so she repeated the phrase with which she ended most of her conversations with Maha. You guys are amazing. And Maha replied, as she always did in these dark times, May God have mercy on us all. Ameen, said Leila, a Christian word that Leila had learned from Maha, but she needed to borrow vocabulary from as many different traditions as possible to navigate a world in which everyone she knew had lost home and loved ones. I love you, and tell your mother that I love her too, and please tell me if I can do anything. To Leila's surprise, Maha responded, Actually, there is. Really? While Leila absolutely meant the offer, she'd grown accustomed to its dismissal. Yes, there are so many wealthy people in Kuwait, and the Kuwaiti government itself has done a lot to help. For sure, Leila agreed. She was proud to be a resident of Kuwait, a great place to live. I know that you're doing everything you can to help your own family. Yes, darling, as I know you are. Well, said Maha, Samir and I were talking the other day, and we were wondering if you could help us maybe find some help? We don't want you to send us anything, but we wondered if you could ask around with your friends and your husband's friends if anyone can help Samir's project. Sure, I can ask. Then tell them he doesn't just serve Christians, okay? That's important. Yes, he's a pastor, and his work is in the church, but you know, Sham, Christians and Muslims still get along in Damascus. It's not like the media keeps saying. Of course. The church helps everyone that they know who needs it, as much as they can help. But they want to do a bigger project, and they need help to do it. My dear friend, it would be an honor to help you. I don't know what I can do, but let me ask. Thank you. You inspire me, said Leila. With your father and your brother, you have every right to run away to complain. You should, but instead you're thinking of others. What else can we do? Leila knew there was no good answer to a question like that. Too many conversations these days were filled with unanswered questions. A moment of bloated silence later, Maha said, I have to go. Thanks so much for calling. I love you. Please come visit soon. I love you too. Bye. Still on the veranda facing Bird, Maha puffed her way through another cigarette, wondering at the ironies of life. Talking about a fundraising campaign and the destruction of her house and the death of her brother and her husband's ministry to displaced families, as if such things were normal as sharing a recipe for a new sweet or admiring the music videos of the newest pop star. Why could she not explain her frustration to her dearest friend Leila? Why did she resort to laughter and words of inspiration? If she couldn't be honest with Leila, she couldn't be honest with anyone. Leila would understand, but instead Maha allowed herself and her husband to sound like saints, subtly implying that Leila should feel guilty for living a life of comfort in a country that didn't border Syria. And she'd laughed off her father's death. Of course. What else could someone with a limp heart do? She didn't want to, of course, but she'd never known loss in her entire life. She had grown up living a predictable and happy existence, with dependable friends and an early marriage to a man who was the envy of all the other girls, a man she loved deeply. A religious man who stuck with her, even though he was surely embarrassed that his wife took to withdrawing into tobacco and alcohol. So Maha, too, had been raised to expect everything to fall into place, and it had so far. For this new chapter, she had no role models and no words of wisdom upon which to draw. She'd never read any books about suffering or loss or doubt or fear. She had no vocabulary for the disquiet she now began to feel as reality began to settle over her weakened heart, like a paperweight might land on a feather pillow. In films, people cried when a loved one died, but this was not her way. People screamed and wailed, but no tears came to Maha's eyes. What she knew, though, was that this feeling was squeezing. Her heart was too weak, too soft to withstand the heaviness. While she might be able to dodge the blows of others' loss, she couldn't dodge the cannonball that was her own loss. She'd laughed about it with Leila because she had no words. She didn't even know what her own emotions were, only that they hurt. And the longer she sat on her little Beirut balcony, facing Bird and the neighbor's window that was no more than 2 meters away, working her way slowly through an entire pack of cigarettes, the greater the pain. She had to stop thinking about it. There was no other way. She refused the mental images of her father's embrace, or of the day he proudly drove her to the university to register, or of that precious moment when he walked her down the aisle. She refused the memories of playing hide-and-seek with Hani when he was only 4 and she already a teenager, of teasing him about his first crush, and most especially of his visit to Beirut just a month ago, when she had begged him to stay on in Beirut and register at a Lebanese high school, and he'd insisted that he loved his school in Sidnaya and that Mama and Baba would miss him too much. Those and so many more memories threatened to overtake her mind and squeeze their way into her heart, but she pushed them away. She went inside, turned on the television, and pulled a beer from the fridge.